Great. So it's good to be here. Yeah, on that interruptions, I mean, I know conventions are different. Sociology convention is usually you give the whole talk, but I'm totally fine with questions of questions of clarification are probably easiest, because if not, I probably won't get through everything. So I think please let me know if you have any questions of clarification. It's always wonderful to be here in this very, very scenic room in the state of my birth, because those of you all who were here before, I'm from Milwaukee, so it's good to be here. So I actually realized I talked about monetary sanctions here, I think 3 years ago. I don't know if it was IRP or if it was in sociology. So some of you might already know what monetary sanctions are, but I know crowds change, so this will be new to many of you all. But my talk today will be on the relationship between what are monetary sanctions, I'll talk about that, but fines, fees in the criminal legal system. So when somebody's convicted, there's all kinds of money parts of their conviction that we don't often talk about, and the relationship between that and the housing system. Dawn's going to bring me a microphone just because we're so nice and spread out. So this won't affect the recording, I hope?
No.
Okay. All right. Oh, that's much better. Then I don't have to yell and you all can hear every word. This is fabulous. Thank you, Dawn. All right. So I am an ethnographer. Oh, let me say this is a paper co-authored with graduate student Erica Banks, professor at UMass Amherst, Brian Sargent, and graduate student at University of Georgia, Daniel Boches. Funded by Arnold Ventures, a project headed up by Alexis Harris at the University of Washington. And the paper is forthcoming in the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences. So I'm an ethnographer and a qualitative researcher, so I'm going to begin with a story. As a part of this big study, the multi-state study of monetary sanctions, we interviewed a woman named China. That's not her real name, it's her pseudonym, who was a 25-year-old black woman living in Texas. Here, I mean we, the big team, not I was the Illinois part that I'll talk about, but our team interviewed a woman living in Texas with a monthly income of roughly $1,600 and had had long periods of unemployment. And her story sketches this circular pattern that I'm going to be talking about throughout the talk. This relationship between housing instability, the mechanisms that bring people into the criminal legal system because of housing instability, then the fining and feeing, or the sentencing to fines and fees that are the LFOs, or legal financial obligations, or monetary sanctions, or fines and fees. I'll use all of those words interchangeably. Then how that monetary sanction leads through various mechanisms back to housing instability. So it is this churn that I'll be talking about today, and China's story illustrates that churn. So the interviewer asked China how she ended up in the county jail, which is where they had interviewed her right after she got out. And China answered, "County, I went for several reasons. Okay, I was living with my family member, which is my sister. She was kind of mad that I didn't give her any money. I didn't have any money, rent, for water, whatever she needed it for. I was just like, I don't have that. I just started my job. She's the type, if I make 100, she wants 80. I'm like, okay, what am I going to live off of? I can't give you all that I have." She just basically kicked us out, me and my boyfriend at the time. She kicked us out, but she wanted to go out with a fight. She wanted to see this down, like, I'm going to basically ruin your life. She tried to fight me and I fought back. Then she made up a whole lie and said that me and my boyfriend jumped her. Me and him ended up going to jail. So China spent a week in jail. This wasn't her first brush with the law. She had had several driving without insurance charges, and she had had an assault charge from when she was a juvenile. But China's driving without insurance charges, many of her car-related infractions, were in fact also related to housing. When the interviewer asked her where she was currently living, she said, quote, "I just live wherever I may live, really, in my car. Sometimes we ask people for money to get a hotel or something like that. It's hard. It's been hard." So when one's car is one's home, you can imagine all of the kinds of encounters with law enforcement that ensue for daily excursions. And if you don't have enough money to pay for an apartment, you're likely not going to have enough money to pay for insurance, even though your car is where you need to live and get around in. So for China, this resulted in being pulled over for all kinds of things, including one time being pulled over for driving while intoxicated. And she narrated it as follows. The prosecutor is trying to tell me the deal's off. I have to pay up all this money, $800, and then everything that I owe him, far as the fees, to get my car out, all based on a DWI. I'm just like, oh my God. Now I'm really setting myself behind because I was supposed to be in my apartment already. I'm not even stable to even just do anything that normal citizens do. So China's story and this research illustrates how that family instability, she's basically doubling up, living with her sister, that causes stress in the family, leads to, in this case, an altercation, which then calls the police, which leads her to her going to jail, which creates Lfos, which means that then she has to pay those Lfos, or monetary sanctions, which she does not have, to be able to get out of the criminal legal system, which she cannot do, and then feeds back into her housing insecurity because she cannot get into her apartment, as she says at the very end. In the research on housing, researchers who, I'm sorry, let me just turn this page over. So we see this full cycle. What I'm going to go through today is to back up from that vignette, go over what are monetary sanctions, talk about what already exists in the research just a little bit. We already know there's a homelessness incarceration cycle, but that's a little narrower than what we're talking about because we're talking about more than homelessness. We're talking about housing insecurity much more broadly. And we're talking about something different than incarceration and actually much more widespread than incarceration because many more people have fines and fees than are actually put in jail. Ultimately, China said she owed, quote, I think it's over $5,000, over $10,000 it has to be. So the ubiquity of these fines and fees and the extent of them really have these ramifications for housing. All right, so what are monetary sanctions? As I mentioned, fine, fees, surcharges, interest. They have different names in every state. These are governed by state law. And costs is another word. But basically, you get sentenced them whenever you're convicted of a misdemeanor, felony, or traffic offense. There are also monetary sanctions that you get even if you're not convicted. In some states, you have to pay for the public defender that might have gotten you a non-conviction, but you still have a fee to pay for the public defender. So they're, like I said, they're governed in state law. So here we have the Illinois state law where you see the particular offense, misdemeanor drug offense, how much you get fined or how much the total monetary sanction is, in this regard, $905, and then a series of instructions about how this $905 is divvied up across various public entities. So those numbers don't add up to 905 because it goes on to the next page, HIJKLM. So I just didn't put them all here. So it goes into different public coffers. So this is where it begins, state law, $905 for a misdemeanor drug offense. It then shows up if you have committed a misdemeanor drug offense, you go to court. If you are found guilty, you are sentenced. And this is a sentencing order from a county in Illinois that replicates what's in the state law and that lists the various kinds of offenses and the accompanying cost. So the clerk would write in $905 here and total it up on the bottom. So from the legislation to the courthouse to the bill that the defendant gets. So this is this person who's committed a misdemeanor drug offense will see when they go online to see how much they owe. This person owes $1,200. That's because they got the $905, plus they had a crime laboratory fee because of the analysis of the drugs. and they got a fine on top of those other costs, which were the assessments, and then the fine is supposedly the penalty part. So when you add those two things up with the $905, you get $1,200. That's what they see on their bill. This says they paid $145. In fact, they didn't really pay anything. Your bail, if you posted bail, your bail, if you're then let out, first goes to pay this before it goes back to whoever might have put it up for you. So this is what monetary sanctions are. This is what the person will have to pay off in order to fully complete their sentence. If they got probation, they'll have to do their probation plus pay this. And they could remain in the criminal legal system, coming back month after month, week after week in some cases, for a status hearing on their case if they have this money left over. So the homelessness, so now let me talk a little bit about how this relates to housing. We already know that there's a relationship between homelessness and incarceration. Again, a cyclical relationship. It refers to the criminalization of homelessness through such laws as criminal trespassing and anti-panhandling laws and so on, that then sweep people without homes into the criminal legal system, incarcerate them for days perhaps, and then which destabilizes even people who might have come in housed but now can't go to work or lose access to social networks, and then coming out of prison, or either prison or jail, have bouts of homelessness. So this is established in the literature. Between 10 to 15% of people incarcerated in jails and prisons experienced homelessness in the year before their incarceration. And then people who have experienced incarceration are 4 to 10 times as likely to be homeless as those in the general population. So this relationship is established. What we're doing those are some of the citations and those statistics I just mentioned. What we're doing is moving beyond incarceration. Don't get me wrong, incarceration, I don't want to stymie any research on incarceration, but there are many more parts of the criminal legal system that are important, and indeed fines and fees impact a much broader swath of the population who are involved in the criminal legal system. So going beyond incarceration to talk about legal financial obligations or monetary sanctions, and going beyond homelessness to talk about housing insecurity. So these financial penalties that are LFOs present a direct connection between the criminal legal sanctioning and affording the necessities of daily life. Monies used to pay LFOs are unavailable to pay for food, transportation, healthcare, and housing. Studies in the growing field of monetary sanctions mention this housing instability as a possible outcome of LFOs, but this is the first paper to really look directly at this relationship. So I want to elaborate on some of the mechanisms and the relationships that we talked about in the beginning. So housing instability consists of homelessness, yes, but also doubling up and living with friends and family, if that is not the person's preference. Frequent moves, so housing mobility, eviction, and housing cost burden, which is basically paying 30% or more of your income towards rent. A housing cost burden suggests that you don't have sufficient money to pay for other things. These kinds of housing instabilities then work through stress, family conflict, as we saw in the story with China, multiple household members, public civility ordinances that criminalize homelessness as an example. But it's really, I'll be focusing on some of the stress and family conflict mechanisms that lead to people having criminal legal contact that then lead to the fines, fees, surcharges, probation costs, program costs like anger management classes, domestic violence classes, substance abuse classes. Those are also parts of the monetary sanctioning system. They're not in those numbers I showed you in state law, but they're nonetheless things people have to pay in order to complete their sentence. bail and restitution. All of that, of course, makes it hard to pay for your rent. It negatively affects your credit. It makes it impossible to save, and it creates financial trade-offs between paying your fines and fees or paying all these other things, including housing, which then leads back into, now you gotta, maybe you were housing secure before, you were living on your own, now you're in this system and you come out, and now you have to move in with your grandmother. Now you have to move in with your sibling. Now you're homeless. Now you're in an apartment that really is unaffordable. All of this is in the context of, obviously, economic fragility, meaning this churn is not relevant for high-income people who have a criminal misdemeanor drug possession, pay the $1,200 fine, do their probation, and they're done. This is not relevant for high-income people, so it's within a context of economic fragility, high housing costs, few living wage jobs, and then the important issues of substance use and mental illness as well, and criminal background discrimination that makes housing difficult for people who are criminal legal involved as well. So in the research on housing, we see lots of stuff on homelessness, and again, our intervention really is about broadening that beyond. All right. One thing I also want to say is we can't empirically say where this circle begins. We would need we have qualitative data for the most part, and some, as I'll show you, national correlational data. But we can't really tell you where this begins. Like, are people who are housing secure getting LFOs and then moving into housing instability, or is it really people who are all starting off housing unstable who are in this? We need longitudinal data with information about both housing and criminal legal debt, which really very few surveys include this kind of information with longitudinal data, again, because we got to get the sequencing. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. So what is the study? This is the 8-state study of monetary sanctions. The 8 states are California, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, New York, Texas, Washington. So we, myself, and some of the co-authors and graduate students were the Illinois team. The data consists of surveys and qualitative interviews with 519 people sentenced to pay LFOs in those 8 states. Qualitative interviews with 442 court actors. These are judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, probation officers, court clerks, and nearly 2,000 hours of ethnographic courtroom observations across these 8 states. What you'll see here is that the people in our sample are very housing insecure. 50% of them, this is, again, the 8-state sample, 519 people who did the survey, 50% of them had experienced homelessness in their lives. 5% were homeless at the time of the survey. 11% were living in shelter, transitional housing, and 31% were living in the residence of friends or family. Again, that's involuntarily. So only 54%, we might say, were kind of living on their own and that doesn't mean they weren't housing insecure, though. They could have been housing cost burdened, or they could have been frequently moving, but some of these are a little clearer in terms of housing insecurity. Most were renters. Some lived rent-free, again, with a family member. 13% were owner or mortgage. 18% received some kind of housing subsidy, and the mean monthly housing cost was $660. That might sound reasonable, and you might say affordable, but when you think about the fact that the mean income, which I'm not showing here, was $1,500 a month, that showed that on average people were paying 44% of their income towards rent, which is what we define as housing cost burdened. Again, housing cost burden being above 30% of one's income. We start with a national picture. This is the only national survey to include criminal legal debt, the Federal Reserve Survey of Household Economics. I was just emailing with Tim Smeating, who let me know he wasn't going to be able to be here, but said that he is trying to get a question on criminal legal debt on the Survey of Consumer Finances, which would be very interesting for data purposes. So this national survey shows that 6% overall of households overall had legal debt. This is unpaid legal fees or court fines, fees, the kinds of things we're studying. 10% of people who were earning under $40,000 had legal debt. And then I don't have this up here, but 20% of people who had a friend or family member who had been in jail or prison had criminal legal debt. Gives you a sense of the scope nationally. And clearly more relevant for lower income populations. And in this data, we can again look at some just correlational relationships between having criminal legal debt and various measures of housing insecurity. And basically across the board, having criminal legal debt is related to related to housing insecurity on many measures. So people with criminal legal debt are less likely to be homeowners, for example. People with criminal legal debt are more likely to have moved within the last 2 years. People with criminal legal debt are more likely to be living with other individuals, more likely to be living with a parent, more likely to have an adult household in the adult child in the household. Then on the other side, people with criminal legal debt are less satisfied with their housing quality, less satisfied with their housing costs. Renters, these are the proportion of renters who have housing quality problems, no plumbing, vermin infestations, more salient among people with criminal legal debt. A much higher proportion of people who have criminal legal debt moved because of eviction, moved because the landlord said that they had to leave, or moved because they had missed rent. So at the snapshot national correlational level, we see this relationship between well beyond homelessness, criminal legal debt, and all manner of kinds of housing instability. So let me talk about the qualitative data that gives some stories behind these kinds of correlations. And I will do that in 2 parts. You remember that circle, so I'm going to do the first half of the circle, which is from housing insecurity to Lfos, to criminal legal sanctions, and then I'll do from Lfos, criminal legal sanctions, to housing insecurity. So from housing insecurity to criminal legal sanctions. First example comes from Minnesota, from our ethnography there. A tall white man appeared in a Minnesota courtroom during one of our team's observation periods. He had been in custody for 5 days and had had a public defender who announced that the man was homeless with several medical issues. The facts of the case were as follows. He got off of a bus and went into the airport to use the bathroom. He then sat down and wouldn't leave immediately when the security guard asked him to. The charge was trespassing, and he pled guilty, even though when the judge asked him if he understood that he was trespassing, he answered only, "I guess." The judge imposed a $50 fine. But upon the argumentation of his defense attorney about her client's homelessness, the judge stayed that fine. Now, to stay a fine doesn't mean that it's waived. It doesn't mean that it disappears. It just means that if the defendant doesn't comply with the other terms of the sentence, the $50 comes due. If the defendant does comply with the other terms of the sentence, then the $50 is not collectible. So the judge couldn't dispense with the $75 mandatory surcharge, but he ordered that it be paid over a period of 180 days. The judge noted that if the defendant did not pay the surcharge at the end of that 180 days, it would be deemed uncollectible after that. Now, in Minnesota, that could mean one of 2 things. It could mean that it was converted into a civil matter, and it would be turned over to a collections agency to collect, or it could be written off as a loss by the state agency. The first, of course, would have impacts on this person's credit because it goes into a civil matter and goes into a collections agency. And the second is really a win for the person in that it's just written off. But overall, this is a case of a person without a home who uses the airport for personal hygiene and refuge and owes $75 to the state of Minnesota and likely $125 because if he doesn't pay the $75, which the judge couldn't waive, then the $50 comes due because he didn't comply with the first part of the sentence. So this scenario was extremely common in our data. It transpired in every state, and I won't give you all the data that we have in the paper, and surely not all the data we have in our data set, but I want to give you one more such example, and that comes from the state of Washington. Here's a conversation in our interview between Sean, a pseudonym, who's a 43-year-old man in Washington state. And the interviewer asks, "How much do you worry about your LFOs?" Respondent, "I quit worrying about it. I just accepted being homeless." And the person says, "Yeah?" And he says, "Yep, too poor to make it." And the interviewer says, "So where do you tend to stay right now?" And Sean says, "On the street, like in front of buildings, on the side of buildings. Like I just had court today because I got woken up behind AM/PM. That's a chain store like Walgreens on the West Coast. I got woken up behind AM/PM. And so they gave me a trespassing charge for sleeping behind AM/PM. The interviewer asked, "Okay, does that happen frequently? Like, does it happen often, I guess you could say?" And Sean said, "Yeah, with everyone. Yeah, it's illegal to be homeless in this county." And the interviewer said, "It's illegal to be homeless in this county?" And Sean said, "Yeah. So you just end up getting all these extra charges on it. It's not clear if he meant charges on being homeless or charges on the fine that you get for the trespassing. So you get all these extra charges on it." And the interviewer asked, "Does that add up to more fees and fines and all that?" Sean says, "Yeah." Interviewer, "So it keeps building?" "Yeah." Interviewer, "So can you think of a way of getting out of debt? Or is it basically like this is just kind of," and the respondent said, "Yeah, get out of this county." So there is no statute in the state of Washington that says it's illegal to be homeless. But what the law does say is that it's illegal to trespass. Trespassing, quote, "upon the premises of another," is what Sean was charged with for sleeping on the property of AM/PM. It was a simple misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of up to $1,000 and a 90-day jail term. Sean reported that even prior to that most current arrest, he had received fines and fees of $1,000, but that the interest for not paying that $1,000 had accumulated to a total of $2,500 that he currently owed. Notices about what he owed were being sent to his father's house. He was on a payment plan of $50 a month. Sometimes his father paid that $50 a month, and other times Sean, again in this trade-off between what to pay, paid that $50 a month. And he paid it out of his disability check, which was his sole mode of income. And he described his income as this: "It's supposed to be $750. I get $680 after child support, and then I have to pay another $50 for fines." So Sean's LFOs take up 7% of his net disability check. Basically, this is the first part of the circle. I don't have the circle up anymore. From housing instability, homelessness in this case, to through the mechanism of trespassing, which is the legal criminalization of homelessness, into owing fines and fees. I've given you the example of China already that showed you how family conflict and housing instability can move people into the criminal legal system. But let me talk about China's husband, Glenn, who had a very similar story as China. So this is not about explicit laws, but rather about that mechanism of multiple family household members causing family conflict and stress. So China's husband told us this, quote, "I got a terroristic threat misdemeanor. My biological mom, she's not in her right mind because of substances, but she called the police, and it was like I went to jail for a terroristic threat. I didn't even get to tell my side of the story. It was like it didn't matter whether I was telling the truth or not. Misdemeanor class B, and they arrested me." So the volatile situation that led to this misdemeanor class B, which also included Glenn's mother's drug-using boyfriend, made it clear that he had to move out of his mother's house. But his mother wasn't, like China's sister in some regards, wasn't going to let it go down so easily. Glenn said, I was already gone, like walking down the street with all my stuff, and they still came and got me. Once he was charged and in the criminal legal system, he talked about how the fines, fees, and costs all started to add up. He had to pay for a lawyer. Then he got a toothache while in jail and was charged for medical expenses. He said, they charge you in jail for medical. Like they say when you go to jail, your medical is free and all that, but they're really charging you. Once he was sentenced to probation, he had to come up with more money. He said, quote, whether you've got to go to weekly check-ins, that cost, or a weekly drug test, that cost. So like China, Glenn's problematic housing arrangement led to court involvement and court costs, which in turn contributed to the fact that he and China could not afford regular housing and were living out of their car. So then the final example I want to give is from Missouri and from our ethnography in Missouri, where we observed a white man in his 30s who was facing a probation revocation hearing. He had been staying with his mother after his conviction, but his mother threw him out because he wasn't getting along with his stepfather. Again, you see how living with family members leads to family conflict. And again, the context often of sometimes substance abuse, sometimes mental health issues, but not always. So when he left his mother's house, he didn't report it to his probation officer. And that was a violation and ended him back in court. So we weren't able to observe the second time when he was sentenced on this probation violation, but a probation violation can lead to resentencing on your initial offense and could have landed him in jail or could have led to additional fines and fees from the first conviction. All right, so that's that half. That's from housing instability to having to pay criminal legal sanctions. Now from being sentenced to pay fines and fees to housing instability. So I'll start with an example from New York with a woman whose Lfos impacted her homeownership. Now, as I mentioned, only 13% of the people that we talked to were homeowners. So this is a minority case, but it illustrates, we want to kind of look beyond the more destitute cases in our study. So studies already show that incarceration negatively affects home ownership, but there isn't any equivalent research on legal financial obligations. There's some suggestions. So a paper by Bryan finds that conviction alone, without incarceration, is negatively associated with home ownership. And we might imagine that conviction alone, since we know conviction comes with financial sanctions, even when it doesn't have incarceration, that might be one of the mechanisms why conviction alone is negatively correlated with home ownership. In this case, Carol, a 51-year-old woman in New York, was one of the minority of homeowners we interviewed, and she was in court when we first met her for a DWI after having been sober for 12 years. She said, quote, I kind of slipped up. Carol was sentenced to 3 years of probation and $995 in fines and surcharges. She originally set up a $50 monthly payment plan, but returned to court to request a reduction to $20 a month. It's important to highlight how small amounts of money can be really debilitating for many of the people that we interviewed. Again, with a mean income of $1,500, a $50 a month fine can be a lot, especially if you're managing a household on that. So she returned to court to request this reduction to $20 a month. She had been out of work for over a year, and she said that the previous month she had only 78 cents left in her account after she paid all her bills, and after she paid her bills and her LFOs. She was particularly concerned about losing her house. And she said, I'm not working and I don't have the money to pay for everything, you know? And I'm afraid that I might have to sell my house, which is scary, you know? At least I have equity in it because I've been here for so long, but still, you know? So the LFOs are now possibly destabilizing her housing situation again. The equity is a positive thing, but losing the home would be because of the competing financial obligations once she has these LFOs. So fines and fees are meant to punish, but I guess the question is to what extent? Is it about losing one's shelter and housing equity wealth for a DWI? I think that's a real conversation, actually. I mean, I think some people might say, yes, don't drive drunk then. So I think that's something we can talk about, but I wanted to raise it. All right, second example, a Georgia man, Jacob, 26-year-old man in Georgia, living in an apartment with his father while his wife and 3 children lived with their mother. So lived with his wife's mother. So he's living with his father, his wife and 3 children living with her mother. It was partially because of where the son's school was and who could be closest to the school, but also because Jacob didn't get along so well with his wife's mother. So he was living with his father. But the primary reason was that neither he nor his wife and the family as a whole could afford a place of their own. That's why the family was splitting up. And why couldn't they afford a place of their own? Part of it was Jacob's financial woes due to his $6,500 in monetary sanctions. He had a stipulation as part of his probation that he could only work on the weekends. He told us, quote, I'd have to work a lot of weekends just to pay $6,500. And I can't pay to get my own place or anything like that. So Jacob longed for housing independence as an adult and to be able to live with his wife and children, but that criminal legal debt made it impossible to pay for their own residence and pushed them into the housing insecurity again, not homelessness, but doubling up with family. And if we think about the circle, one could imagine how living with his father, her living with the mother with the 3 kids could start this cycle once again. A defense attorney in Texas, the third example, reported that living with family members was a widespread response to having LFOs. The defense attorney said, quote, yeah, I mean, I've had lots of clients that had to move to smaller houses to afford their payments, meaning their fines and fees payments, not their housing payments. So I've had lots of clients that had to move to smaller houses to afford their LFOs, move in with family members so that they can get through their probation, borrow money from family members to pay their probation, which I'm sure is stress on the whole family. So the folks in the legal world understand this relationship and see quite well, as I'll show in an example a little later, this relationship between LFOs and housing. Yet even when people live alone, their financial resources are reduced because of paying LFOs, and that's the housing cost burden that I want to talk about in example number 4. As I've mentioned all along, the threshold for housing cost burden is 30% of your income. And when your household financial resources are depleted, obviously 30% becomes a much smaller number. And if your rent stays the same, you're likely to move into being housing cost burdened. A defense attorney in Georgia talks specifically about fines and fees and likened them to many other expenses that low-income families cannot meet. She said, quote, for my clients, it's just another bill that they're never going to be able to pay. These are already people who are one bad day away from homelessness. And this is just another thing that shaves that base they've got even thinner, end quote. This figurative language of shaving that base is exactly what housing cost burden is about. It's about reducing the income available for housing that makes housing a larger proportion of one's total income. And then the final example brings us back to homelessness and shows how legal financial obligations can directly move people into homelessness. Bobby, a 23-year-old white and Latino man in California, estimated that he had, quote, upwards of $20,000 in legal debt from over 5 mostly drug-related misdemeanors. In a cascading spiral of events, These expenses led directly to his homelessness. Bobby lost his driver's license because, quote, my fines stacked up so high, end quote. In an attempt to get his driver's license back, he entered a $500 per month payment agreement, which was directly taken out of his check. So this is available in state law in most states, that your wages can be garnished to pay your criminal legal debt. So he was getting $500 taken out of his paycheck. He was working at Domino's Pizza at the time. Soon the deduction overwhelmed his income, and his housing was the first casualty. Bobby told us, quote, I got kicked out of my apartment because of that. I couldn't afford my apartment anymore. My roommate had to find a new roommate. I lost my apartment. I was homeless for a long time, actually, while still working a job. So Bobby didn't lose his apartment because of some of the things we already know about how the criminal legal system affects housing. Mostly we know that having a criminal background negatively affects your possibility of getting housing, for example. So this wasn't about a criminal background check or about being incarcerated. This was about not being able to afford it because of the financial side of the criminal legal system. So let me conclude and talk about where I think this research can contribute. So we're thinking about two literatures that I think are pretty obvious from this. First, we show that the focus on incarceration in the research on collateral consequences of the criminal legal system is too narrow. So yes, incarceration is important, but there are collateral consequences of so many other components of the criminal legal system, and this financial side is a very clear place that is creating collateral consequences. It's ubiquitous, meaning, for example, in Illinois, 98% of all people with a criminal conviction are sentenced to pay monetary sanctions. So it's ubiquitous, and it is damaging, especially for the lower income, the people who are on the lower income of the spectrum. Second, we contribute to the research on housing by uncovering monetary sanctions as an understudied contributor to housing problems. So if the basic cause of housing insecurity is limited resources, then having to pay monetary sanctions further limits those resources available to pay housing costs. As many jurisdictions are moving to decrease prison populations, as we move in a kind of decarceration direction, which we are moving in, unfortunately, what they're replacing incarceration with is fines and fees. And so I think we need to be very vigilant against replacing incarceration with fines and fees that have similar kinds of collateral consequences, and particularly collateral consequences towards in the realm of housing. For planners, which I don't think there are any planners in the room, but I'll talk about it anyway. I think we obviously need to talk about the decriminalization of housing. Now, as I said, in Washington State, it's not illegal to be homeless, but it's illegal to do a lot of the things that unhoused people do. And that is a cycle that obviously is also, from the public coffer's perspective, an expensive cycle. And the research definitely shows that it's much cheaper to give people housing than to incarcerate people, because as we all know, mass incarceration is very expensive. And then we need to think about the role of housing assistance, Section 8 vouchers, low-income housing tax credit units, affordable housing more general, in kind of intervening in this cycle. And we need to think about, obviously, the rules about people with criminal records living in subsidized housing, which basically excludes people with criminal records from subsidized housing, as contributing to homelessness once they get out. So to conclude, I think that is, not all defendants are involved in the law because of, like China, because they are living in their car or they're in stressful and overcrowded households. But what we have shown in our research is that this housing instability is one of the outcomes of this financially punitive part of the criminal legal system. In other research, I have shown how this part of the criminal legal system is extractive and builds on a kind of financialization model of the public sector. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But the point of our work is to show the human costs of this criminalization of poverty, here with the focus on housing. A defense attorney in Illinois, defense attorneys were often usually the most sympathetic of our interviewees, but even they get a little hardened to this fact. And so I want to end with this quote, but caution us all not to be so hardened. This defense attorney in Illinois said, quote, "I mean, I hear people complain, but I'm going to be honest. After 20 years, and also knowing I can't do anything about that fine or fee amount, and the fact that you can't find a job and you got put out of your house, I'm only listening with one ear, really. Sad as that is, I'm only listening with one ear." So what we hope by doing this research is by identifying this relationship between housing instability and legal financial obligations is that we all open up our ears and that we listen to how this criminalization of poverty leads to many of the other kinds of negative outcomes that many of us study. And I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I'm going to start from the back. Oh, Max, I can even recognize you through your mask.
Hi. I wanted to ask about, I mean, I think this is, like you said, I think one of the great points of this work is sort of the human cost, the demonstration of this sort of cost. And we know in other arenas where there are people who are easily exploited in a financialized system, there are all these sort of predatory mechanisms that spring up to basically fill these gaps that people, might have in their needs, right? And I'm wondering if, I know it's not really the focal point of the project, but I'm wondering if you have found, or if your respondents are talking about any other kinds of predatory services that are catering to this already super exploited group that end up being, more extractive, right? More harmful. Even though they're trying, ostensibly sort of filling some kind of housing service or fulfilling some kind of bill pay, helping you pay your bills, and on either side of the housing or sanction.
Yeah, that's a great question. The only thing that comes to mind is really on the bail front, and Joss Page at Minnesota has been writing about this. On the bail front, there is, of course, a whole infrastructure of predatory basically bail bonds people who front the bail so that you get your family member out of jail and then you owe that person if your family member doesn't show up or all manner of things. So that's the thing that in terms of, but what we argue in this paper that I was talking about the financialization part is that it's really the court itself which becomes predatory. So the paper that I'm talking about the financialization side, it's called Layaway Freedom. And it's about how the courts start to look like a layaway counter at your local Walmart. Meaning what we saw in our courtroom observations was defendant comes to the bench and the judge says, how much are you paying today? And the person says $20. And the judge says, okay, go see the clerk. And like person after person after person. And what these people were doing were paying on their freedom. Their freedom is on layaway. They'll get it when they pay it all down. And the court is the layaway desk as they come to pay. So predatory. I mean, here we have the state basically extracting money from folks who don't have it. In a very inefficient way. So the Brennan Center at the NYU, not that I'm saying we should efficiently extract money, don't get me wrong, but the Brennan Center at NYU has basically shown, they don't, it's hard to get data on this, but like in the state of Arizona, or was it Texas, something like, they spend like $170 to get, for every $100 that they get. They spend $170 on the fact that there's this high-paid judge up there. There's the bailiff, there's this whole court system to get $20 a month from this person. So, I guess to answer your question, it is the courts that start to look extractive, predatory, and that, again, in another paper that we have, super duper undermines people's sense of trust in legal institutions and the state more generally. and, I think has just very widespread ramifications for kind of civic, democracy, civic senses of civic justness, and so on. So that the morphing of courts into predatory, extractive spaces, I think, has a much bigger footprint. So I'm working my way up, 1, 2, 3, then I'll go back there and then I'll come here. Yes?
Thanks so much. This is very interesting. And I'm just wondering if in your conversations, I know you had mentioned one of the interviewees, she talked about going in and requesting a reduction from $50 to $25 on her payment plan. And I was just wondering if that was something that came up a lot, that people were aware of having the capacity to negotiate their payment plans or the costs, and I don't know, like on the legal side, like what sort of movement capacity there is, but like is there a lot of agency in that side? Like, are people doing what they can, and are they aware of
Right.
it? And then also, like, can like they get a judge type revisit and totally like drastically reduce the amount? Is that like within this sort of confines of the
Right, yeah. So good questions. One thing I'll say is post-sentencing, they are pretty much on their own. So in terms of what social services or legal support they get post-sentencing, once they've been sentenced to pay, say, $905, they no longer have a public defender, they no longer have anybody, so they really have to advocate for themselves. So your question is a good one, meaning do people know? They surely would not find out from any lawyer because they no longer have any representation post-sentencing. And then I would say methodologically, it's kind of hard to answer your question since we were at the courthouse watching people who were coming in making various claims. What we can say is that, it was not uncommon to see people who just didn't show up for their court date. So one could surmise some people didn't know they could come in and say, I owe $50, but can I pay $20? And since they knew they didn't have the $50, they just didn't show up. That's a possibility, which of course has even more negative ramifications because then they can have a warrant out for their arrest if they don't show up. So the kind of widespread awareness of renegotiating one's debt, and here the whole language shows just how much this has become a financial institution, not one that's about the fact that somebody was driving without insurance or whatever the original case was. So it's hard to gauge how well people know what they can do. There is likely learning that happens in the court because for any particular court call, the call is you have to be here at 8 in the morning. Somebody's case may not get called till 11. So you're sitting in the court from 8 to 11 watching everybody else go up. That might be a moment of courtroom learning where you can see you might be able to renegotiate your debt. And then the final thing I'll say, because you were gesturing towards or asking about can judges dispense of the debt, judges were not well informed or educated on really what they could do. They would tell us in the interviews with them, there's nothing I can do, which wasn't true at that time in Illinois and surely is not true now. And I think there's probably more education now, partially because of the change in the law. They previously had ability to do waivers. Now the waivers are written into the law, but again, the defendant has to know about them. And at sentencing, it would be the defense attorney, and I'm working with an organization that's trying to do that kind of education so that people know they can apply for these waivers. In terms of policy, that's not my preferred policy solution because it still requires, your first sentence to them, then it requires your ability to apply for the waiver. There's a lot of onus on this person with not a lot of resources, not a lot of time, and so on. Whereas I think the kind of perhaps an ability to pay hearing at the beginning, or, I haven't talked about the larger structure of why we have these fines and fees to begin with, and there's a lot of historical research on that about how they're replacing property taxes from property tax revolts in the 1970s, and, our decisions about how to fund our court system are based on the extraction of funds from the most vulnerable, the people, and the people that are really easy to dump on. Like, of course, those people who are drunk driving should pay all this money. Of course, those child molesters should pay all this money. You know, it's easy to, legislate money to come from those folks, and much harder to raise taxes. Jeff.
This is related, I think, to Lisa's question, but maybe from 30,000 feet a little bit in terms of system design, right? My understanding is a lot of crimes are sort of, if you do this, you're found guilty, there's a possibility of a fine, there's a possibility of some incarceration or some combination of those things. And I always imagined that the idea of having that combination was that the judge could tailor the penalty to the sort of person's ability to pay and so on, right? So that's background. I guess the question then is how much over time caseworkers and I think judges too have lost discretion, right? Sentencing commissions, all this kind of stuff. There was a lot of evidence going back way back now that caseworkers were using their discretion in an unequal fashion across groups, and so it was removed. But this is a place where some discretion might be good. And I guess it's a factual question, how much discretion do the judges actually have in your states? And then a sort of normative question of, do you feel like this is an avenue where the system could be adjusted in an improving way?
So it's a great question. So Illinois changed law in the middle of our study, and there was more discretion before, less discretion now, because the law now not mandates. It's first of all, it systematized the whole amounts being charged. It was a mess. I mean, like that's what the official report said, like, it's a mess. So what you would be charged, how much fines and fees you'd get in one county was totally different from another county, and so on. So they standardized it across the state. There's a sentencing schedule that I showed above. So it created much less discretion, and it created the mechanism, very clear mechanism for waivers. So there's less discretion now. And I actually think less discretion on this front is important because as we've done this research both in counties across Illinois and in states across the country, we know that basically courtroom processes are extremely perfunctory and super quick. There's not a lot of evaluation of the defendant. As my data show here, homeless man in Washington, it's just kind of run through there. So still, I can't do anything about this $75. Yes, I'll stay this $50. They get into courtroom practices that become the norm, and there's not a lot of tailoring to the specific defendant because, there might be 60 people on a court call in the morning, and, there's just neither the defense attorney nor the prosecutor nor the judge has much incentive for a lot of tailoring. So I think structural interventions on this are probably more effective than discretion. In the longer paper, we have one example that kind of shows the exception to the rule, which is, this was in California. A young, maybe 23-year-old man was having to pay $50, paid it that day. Basically, it was the rare time that the court slowed down, and a super sad story emerged that this young person had prostituted himself to get the money to pay the court. And the judge almost, as the observation person wrote in the field notes, almost was in tears. And totally basically said, okay, I'm wiping all of these fines, you're done with us, and then asked a caseworker in the court, is there anything that can be done? But that kind of knowledge about the background at all of the defendant is so rare in our observations that you can't depend on that for giving people some relief. Wait, I thought I saw one more hand over here. One here, and then I'll come on this side. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you so much. I found the whole framework that you laid out incredibly compelling, the evidence you presented. I just wanted to dig in a little bit more to one piece of it, which was around the housing instability, and more specifically around shared housing or doubling up that was going on. I know that multi-generational households and doubling up situations are actually pretty prevalent
Mm-hmm.
But that they, like you alluded to, kind of exist on a spectrum of instability, risk,
Mm-hmm.
conflict, etc. And I think, there hasn't been a lot done kind of looking into what makes them functional versus non-functional arrangements, but my sense is that part of the story has to be some of that structural stuff, like around, the ways that systems have eroded community capacity to provide functional care for each other, like taking in someone who needs a place to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, folks who are struggling with drug addiction and other things may not be as able to provide stable housing for someone who needs it. And I'm wondering the extent to which that framing comes into your thinking about this, because I think oftentimes it's assumed that shared housing or doubling up is kind of inevitably going to fall apart,
Right.
inevitably dysfunctional. But
Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about your thinking of that in the context of this work.
Yeah, totally. Excellent point. And I would say in some regards we're saved by the qualitative nature of the research. So we don't have to be so narrow as to say we're going to use the variable of multi-generational household or adult child living in the house and look to use that as a predictor of LFOs or insecure housing or criminal justice contact or something along those lines. And in that way, hypothesize that it is likely to be a predictor of criminal justice contact and thus stigmatize those kinds of housing arrangements. I think that setup would do that. But I think with the qualitative data, we're able to recognize that such households can also be protective. We may not focus on that in this particular research, but we do recognize it in a footnote, that's for sure. And those protective, though they can, obviously those multi-generational households are the way to keep somebody from criminal legal contact, for example, or obviously avoid homelessness or any number of things that would be positive. There's another variable that has, I think, the same characteristics that you're talking about that I mentioned here, and that's housing mobility. Many people think that multiple moves is a bad thing. But if you're moving multiple times into successively better neighborhoods or closer to jobs or closer to better schools or closer to better childcare or whatever the situation might be, multiple moves is not necessarily it's not necessarily going to be highly correlated with negative outcomes. So one has to really, and I think you can do this qualitatively in the narratives, talk about what was the nature of the multiple moves. Were you moving because you didn't get along with your mother's new boyfriend, or were you moving because you were moving closer to your next job? So I think I would say point super well taken. We recognize that in footnotes, but because the story we're telling here is about the moments in which multiple household members can lead to conflict, that's one mechanism. Those are the ones we focus on. But excellent point. Yes, back in the back.
So you kind of rejected more discretion as being an out here, and talked about having a preference for more systemic reform. Can you describe what you think that systemic reform would look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think fines and fees in the criminal legal system is. So I have another paper called Statutory Inequality. It is, on its face, a different penalty to give, say, a total package of fines and fees of $905 to somebody making $30,000 as opposed to somebody making $130,000. And as a result, so these are unequal penalties. And to me, that is unacceptable. And the person making $30,000 fined for $905 is going to, as a result, spend more time in the criminal legal system, be much more vulnerable to exacerbating events because they're still under the control of the criminal legal system, so have many more negative downstream outcomes than the person who pays their fine and is done. So as a result, I don't think that we should be funding our criminal legal system on the backs of the defendants in the criminal legal system. We all benefit from this system. We don't just pay for, those of us who have had fires in our homes aren't the only one whose taxes go towards the fire department. I don't have any children, yet much of my money goes to the public school system. I use the parks a lot, and so my money goes to the parks, but many of my friends have never stepped foot in a Chicago public park, yet their money is also going to the parks. So most of the things that we do, we fund whether we use them or not. And the criminal legal system is a huge one that we all, I won't say we all benefit from, because many people would say that it's a lose-lose for all of us, but at the very least, it is surely not to the benefit of the defendants in it. In that regard, it's the defendants who are paying for their own prosecution, and perhaps their own unjust prosecution if, we know the disproportionate policing of black communities and the higher sentencing and so on and so forth. So I was using all of that to kind of get to a perspective of get rid of them all. Like, it is inefficient, it is not really collecting the money, it is statutorily unequal, it is extortionist, it is so many things that lead to negative outcomes, this housing part being just one little tiny bit of it, that I think this is not the place to be doing fines and fees. So the question is, how do we punish people for bad behavior? And that's obviously an even bigger philosophical conversation at this moment. I mean, I think those of us who start down the rabbit hole of studying the criminal legal system, and those of us who spend any time observing courts and you get really disenchanted, and it becomes really easy to become an abolitionist, because you really see how there is no care in the criminal legal system. There is very little justice. Now, I know there are many victims of the people that I see the defendants when I'm doing my courtroom observations, and obviously there are victims who I don't see. But I would argue, from what I see, the victims aren't getting any justice either. And so I don't think it's a kind of victim advocate's role to say, well, we got to figure out how to punish people, because I don't see that victims are really getting much justice through the criminal legal system. So that kind of gets me to, we need a much different kind of system that really foregrounds obviously the upfront investments that many of you all are studying, the schools, the mental health care, the substance abuse treatment, the jobs, obviously the housing and so on, and then the kind of more community care stuff on the other end when people fall down. You have a
quick thought.
Yeah.
So when you started off that answer, I thought you were leading into sort of saying maybe economic fees that were set dependent on people's economic situation.
Right. How they do it in Europe.
But maybe you could respond
Yeah.
to that idea.
So day fines is what they're called, and they do that in Europe, and there's lots of research and critique even of that the discretion ends up that even the amount that people are fined are still more than they can pay. And I think the stuff that I've read from Europe suggests that day fines are definitely not the panacea that we might think they are. And given, maybe, no. I was going to say basically that so many people in the criminal legal system are low income that a blanket, it's almost like the fact that in many public school systems, like in the Chicago public schools, we no longer have schools that have free and reduced lunch. They just all have free and reduced lunch because so many of the students are low income. And I was going to say that's why we need to abolish them in the criminal legal system, but then that affirms and lets off the fact that we so disproportionately criminalize low income people. Because it's not like rich people aren't using drugs. It's not like rich people aren't having fights. It's not like rich people aren't doing any of those things. We only just arrest and put in the criminal legal system the low income people. So I don't want to affirm that practice by saying maybe in some parts of the criminal legal system we could abolish the fees and then have them in the more, I guess we could call it egalitarian part, like the speeding tickets, which I think is more evenly distributed across people of various incomes. I haven't thought enough about that, especially the traffic side. It's the traffic side that I probably need to think about a little bit more. Thank you. Yes. Yes, yes, Lynn. Sorry. Hi, Lynn.
Hi. As a scholar too, thinking about this in terms of the intersections with education, and wondering from the national sample how many people had kids, how many were parents, and really that intersection between folks are studying how chronic absenteeism, low-income families are facing huge sanctions monetarily for not having their kids in school, and how that might intersect with the housing instability that you talk about.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I don't know that I have much to say other than it is very clear how we often think of monetary sanctions as a somewhat light and benign kind of sanction. And so what we are trying to do in this research, again, this paper is just on housing, but in the double issue of the Russell Sage Foundation Journal, there are papers on how it impacts health, stress and health, and papers on how it impacts family dynamics and those kinds of things. So I think what we're trying to show is how these are not benign and light touch interventions, especially because they're disproportionately wrought upon people who can't pay them. So they're actually bigger. They're not bigger than necessarily incarceration, but they are much more uneven. I mean, let's be clear. If we locked everybody up who had a DWI, then it would be the same penalty for the person making $130,000 as the person making $30,000. That's at least a little bit more fair, we might say. I'm not proposing that, but to introduce fines and fees then necessarily introduces this unevenness of the kind of sanction. I don't think I quite answered your question, but only to say that if education, it's not a light touch kind of fine.
This is what Catherine does when we're running out of time.
Right, she walks up and says, "It's over, no more." We had one last question. Do we have time?
It's a really short question.
Okay.
Do any of the states, if you're aware of, do they charge interest?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's not even just the $905.
Oh, yes,
If
definitely.
it takes 5 years to pay,
Yes.
they're also accruing interest.
Yes, the statute is very clear. After 90 days not paid, it accrues this. After this not paid, most definitely, yes.
All right, and with that we should conclude. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much.